Okay, welcome. I'm Bob Costrell, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Jim Guthrie, who, as you know from the handout, is a very distinguished and influential scholar, policy advisor, and educational entrepreneur, as well as a good personal friend that I've had the privilege of working with a couple times in recent years. I'm just going to mention a few highlights of Jim's impressive career. His vita is too long to go through much more. Early in his career, he had a stint in the White House under LBJ, wrote speeches for LBJ on education. He later had a stint in the United States Senate as an education specialist. His academic career spanned 27 years at University of California at Berkeley, including a short stint as dean. Seminal contributions, you can see the numbers in the handout with regard to scholarship on education finance, accountability, and education reform policy more generally. Also, as I mentioned, he was an entrepreneur. He founded an important company, MAP, Management Analysis and Planning, during that period, and it is still thriving today. In 1994, he relocated to Vanderbilt, where he built the Ed Policy program there to one of the top in the nation. Among other initiatives, he created the National Center on Performance Incentives, which is a hub for work on performance pay research. And also, associated with the position in Vanderbilt, he is the editor of the influential Peabody Journal of Education. Jim has consulted with about half the states in the nation. In fact, from here he's flying up again to Alaska. Great stories if you get a chance to talk with him about the native villages where they kill a whale and what life is like there. By the way, school lets out. He's consulted with many foreign governments and international organizations, many high honors and awards over his career, and has also held many important professional positions. For example, about 20 years ago, he was the vice president of the American Education Research Association, a position we've learned actually a lot about recently, since one of the current VPs is Bill Ayers, the subject of presidential politics. Now, in Jim's day, standards for that position were not quite as high as they are today. It was enough to have served in the White House as opposed to having tried to bomb it. In the years since, Jim has in fact risen to higher positions, such as the presidency of the American Education Finance Association, which is my own favorite professional organization. His presidential address to that organization, published in Education Finance and Policy, is a font of great wisdom regarding past and future of that field, education finance, and it exhibits actually one of the all too rare hallmarks of true academic temperament that Jim exemplifies, and that's the ability to reflect and occasionally change his mind about key issues as he's done in that field. So Jim has not shared with me the content of his talk today, but just from the title, Sustaining Ed Reform, What to Do When You Do Not Know What to Do, I think we get hints of the wisdom of a very fertile and ever-searching mind, as we will now find out.
You're a prince. Thank you. You're a prince.
Let's see. Can you start this thing here, that part?
Oh.
That's good. It's going to be fun.
Get the...
Here. You just click on this, right?
yeah.
And then, let's see.
There's a button on the bottom right.
Here, you do it.
Here,
You do
right?
Right.
Thank you. Sure. And measure.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob, and I'm genuinely honored to be here. I've never been to this part of Arkansas before. I've been restricted to Little Rock. I did testify in one of your court cases, the Lakeview case. I was an expert witness in that case, and then subsequently cooperated with your state education department in an effort to determine remedies for the Lakeview decision. Bob's introduction is very flattering indeed, and I couldn't help but sit there and remember a far less flattering introduction. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, I was having a midlife crisis. I really didn't know what to do with myself. I already owned a Porsche, so I couldn't go down that route. So I decided, against the advice of all of my colleagues, to run for public office in my hometown then of Berkeley, California. And I was told that, in contrast to what Berkeley expected, I would appear to be a rock-ribbed fascist of some kind. But I ran for school board on a platform where I said that I thought that at a minimum, I tried to be clear, that a minimal threshold is that youngsters should be expected to read and write and count. They could learn other things, that'd be fine, but at least those things. And that generally we ought to promote people and employ people on the basis of their ability and meritorious work. And finally, I said within plus or minus 20%, we ought to know how we're spending the money. That was taken to be a very radical new set of ideas for Berkeley. And I was propelled into office with 36,000 votes, which was 8,000 more votes than the mayor got. So I thought just any day I'd be in the White House. And what I didn't realize is that by virtue of being elected to public office in Berkeley, I'd guaranteed I'd never hold office in any other place. I'd be like Bill Ayers, I suppose, who would have been widely accepted there. But in the course of campaigning, which was very awkward, some of you perhaps have run, and maybe even run successfully for public office, and you will know it is a very humbling experience when you are repeatedly called upon to be nice to people who, if their IQ were 1 point lower, you'd have to water them twice a day, but you can't say that to them. So I remember one lovely lady who said, after hearing my platform remarks, that she liked me a lot, but she didn't think she could vote for me. And I said, well, I wish you would, but why can't you vote for me? Well, I'm afraid that if you're elected, the superintendent of schools won't like you, and he will fire you. And I tried to explain the dynamics of who worked, which was silly. I shouldn't have done that. It turned out she was right. The superintendent didn't like me, and he fomented a recall election. So she sort of knew what she was talking about. But in the course of campaigning, another thing I had to do was to address the Berkeley High School. Berkeley has only one very large high school, about 4,000 students. And I knew that these high school students really didn't care about what I wanted to talk about. I had been a high school teacher. It had been the last honest work I had done, and I knew how hard it was. But I showed up anyway because I was expected to. I got there ahead of time because I'm a Virgo. And the young man who was supposed to introduce me came huffing and puffing up at the last minute, and at least was sufficiently candid to say, ladies and gentlemen, or say to me, Mr. Guthrie, I don't know anything about you. What I thought was, well, that's what I expected. And I said, well, look, just keep it brief. The shorter it is, the happier we'll all be. And he said, all right. And he walked up to a lectern, an audience of about 1,000 people. He said, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to a man about whom I'm told the less said, the better. And it was all uphill from there on. But I did go on to win the election, and therefore, for the next 4 years, I was at the small end of repeated 4-to-1 votes. I opposed International Women's Day as a school holiday. It's not that I don't like women, I do. But the women I saw said, well, every time the school district has a holiday, I have to get babysitters. I thought, well, that's hardly celebrating International Women's Day, but then I was looked upon as some kind of troglodyte for opposing that. And then I really didn't want to participate in the debate about declaring our schools nuclear-free zones because I just didn't think we had a lot of bombs in them anyway, and I thought there were other things we could discuss. But that was that, and now is now. So I'll have to be candid with you. I'm going to say some things today I'm not sure are right. I believe they're right, but I can't be absolutely sure they're right. And I do absolutely welcome your challenges about them. I am treading in an area about which I am not always well informed, and some of you may be better informed, and I will certainly listen to you. Of course, my title is What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do, and already I tip my hand because I don't think we have a very substantial or valid base of information about how to render education better. I wish we did. Often I hear stated, well, we know what to do to make our schools better. What we're lacking is the political will to do it. Or if we would just consult our moral compass, we would do it. And I sort of like that kind of rhetoric, but I don't think it's true in education. I don't think we have sufficient technical certainty in some areas to know what to do. Now, I will grant that there are some policy domains where there is a suggestion of evidence, and I would go with it. But on balance, my lament that I'm going to talk to you about, my overriding concern is that we have not yet constructed a culture of continuous learning, continuous improvement, of scientific experimentation, and of sophisticated randomized field trials that I think medicine generally has, not always, but generally, and I think we need, and that's where I want to head, with, in a policy realm, what do you do when you don't really have certainty about what to do? So a few facts, they won't be surprising to you all, but let's just lay some groundwork. By the way, I have no reluctance about being interrupted by a question, assuming it's a civil question, at any time that you might want to pose something. For those, the statistics I'm about to give are national ones and apply to Arkansas less than in most states. I'm vaguely familiar with the school finance arrangements here, and this is not a wealthy state. This is not New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, or Alaska, or Wyoming. So I know that. But as a nation, in the last 50 years, if you look from 1958 upon the enactment of the National Defense Education Act to today, one sees a 5-fold increase in per pupil spending after controlling for inflation, going from a little over $2,000 50 years ago to over $10,000 per pupil today, nationwide. That's not Arkansas. And if my good friend Richard Rothstein would hear, he would immediately be on his feet saying, but, Jim, you have to acknowledge that what we expect of schools today is not what was expected of them 50 years ago, and he's right. 50 years ago, we were seldom educating handicapped students. We did not serve meals in schools. We did not transport as many students as we do today. We certainly did not have the emphasis upon reducing truancy and encouraging youngsters to persist in school. People didn't stay in school as long as they do today, and we didn't have the current emphasis upon expensive subjects in science that previously, we didn't have it before that we somewhat do now. So I'm not saying this is your father's Oldsmobile American education currently. It's not. And I'll get to the biggest change of all in a moment over that 50, from my perspective, in that 50 years. But nevertheless, even controlling for all the things I mentioned and all the things that Richard Rothstein explains about how schools should be or are justifiably more expensive today, even when I take all that into account, America has made a commitment to paying for its schools. Now, I, like probably virtually everyone here, sure, I'd like more money for schools. That's not my stance. Isn't don't spend any more or we're wasting it everywhere. That's not my stance. But one cannot genuinely or factually say that the United States has defaulted on its schools. We continue to allocate approximately 6% of gross domestic product to schools, and that's been constant over a long period of time. And when you look at the inflation-adjusted figures for 50 years, it's not simply that they go up, but the slope is virtually endlessly up. It's always up. And even in some very bad economic times, in the early 1980s, for example, the slope is still up. So I'm a little, there's a mild part of me that objects to the constant lament from superintendents that they can't predict their budgets. In some instances, that's right. There'll be some dramatic plummet. But generally, if you're a superintendent, what you got per pupil last year, you're going to get 2 or 3% at least more next year. It's very predictable, actually, legislative action or not. Well, despite the continued additions of revenues, if you look over that period of time at the only standardized measures of achievement that are available to us, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, you will see some momentum gained in the late earlies and early 90s in student achievement, particularly the closing of the all too persistent gap between minorities and financially advantaged students, which did close at a period of time in the early years of the Clinton administration, and that appears to have leveled out now. We are not seeing, on a national basis, we're not seeing that gap closing now, and achievement generally is going up. So that's where I want to begin, with an assertion, to be tested with you, that our current system of public schooling in the United States decouples resources from student achievement. It's in the allocation of our financial resources virtually in every school district, public school district in the United States. We don't budget around how to affect achievement. That's not what we do. The system is set up for stability, not improvement. There's just virtually no pressure for improvement in the system. Now, No Child Left Behind starts to alter that, I would agree. But let me now, the press is here, so let me give you at least one thing to write about. America's schools are not dramatically going to get better until some adults suffer when children don't learn. And right now, that very seldom happens. You get paid even if children don't learn. Even if they don't go to school, you get paid. So that is just a fundamental problem that illustrates what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'd like to persuade you. Can I be heard in the back okay? that our fundamental problem is we just don't know enough consistently to elevate student achievement. There are certainly pockets of performance where that is not true. You will read about a particular school that has had some dramatic elevation of student achievement, and it can happen. But it often is not sustained. There'll be a new principal and it'll drop off. Or you examine that school 2 or 3 years later and the condition no longer prevails. There is one state to which I will make additional reference, Texas, where it's not characterized in the same way. They have had a very steady growth in achievement in Texas, and I think for good cause. And there is much, not everything, there's much about the Texas model that I think is useful, and I'll talk about it. But on balance, it's difficult to find examples of sustained elevation in the academic performance of America's public school students anywhere. And I say the reason for that is really the paucity of technical knowledge about how to instruct the students effectively. I'm going to return to this and skip on a moment. Well, why does American education find itself in this condition where there's very little technical knowledge? After all, for 400 years we've been educating students in this geographic area. Haven't we learned something? Actually, I think individual teachers sometimes learn a lot. I have great respect for individual teachers who have accrued a lot of craft knowledge about how to instruct effectively. And I encounter them, I know you do too. The problem is the system presently doesn't carry that knowledge or spread it or even test it very effectively. But one reason why we find ourselves in this condition is that until the latter part of the 20th century, and you can almost specify when, it was the publication in 1983 of A Nation at Risk, a report which could hardly have been more wrong and could hardly have done more good. The inflammatory language, which was crafted by Glenn Seaborg, about whom we spoke earlier today, the inflammatory language in that report about if a foreign power had imposed upon us such mediocrity, we would have taken it to be an act of war. Woo! Wow. It was designed to attract media attention and succeeded quite effectively. But its fundamental thesis was wrong. American school achievement had not gone down to that point. It wasn't any higher than it had ever been, but it hadn't gone down. But nevertheless, it mobilized us for a number of other reform efforts. But for 400 years, this nation had succeeded quite well, I would argue, by educating a slender elite, about 10%, to a pretty high level worldwide. Our highly selective universities and secondary schools were contributing informed labor, manpower, humans, ability, informed ability to operate the military, operate business, operate government, operate academia, undertake research, undertake international relations, and we could do it, and we did it pretty well. And even 100 years ago, only 1%, 2% of our students entered and graduated from high school. It was a very small proportion of our citizenry that we attempted seriously to educate. But it didn't matter, because the nation worked pretty well. There were perturbations like the Great Depression, so on. But on balance, it worked. And for Johnny and Susie, who didn't finish school, who didn't get well educated, there were reasonably well-paying jobs in the private sector.
that enabled them, even if poorly educated, to be reasonably well paid and pursue the American dream. So we get to the latter quarter of the 20th century, and what changes? What changes is the jobs that Susie and Johnny once could get either didn't exist anymore and had been replaced with technology as a substitute, or capital as a substitute for labor, or they'd gone overseas. So now parents come to understand that for the first time in the history of the United States, education individually for their children matters. And then we see the political system beginning to respond to this. And for the first time in our history, and for the first time in the history of the world, a large nation has crafted an effort to educate virtually every child to a far higher standard than was previously the case. Are we succeeding? Not yet. Is it an important aspiration? I believe it is. I'll talk about No Child Left Behind, which I believe has transformed the context in which our schools operate. Is it perfect? Far from perfect. But to do away with it, I think, would be going backwards. But one reason why there's been insufficient, in my judgment, pressure on schools to get better is because up until the last quarter of a century, or shorter, they didn't have to get better. It still worked. Now, were these good enough citizens? I don't, when it comes to the civic side of the ledger, I don't know how well informed they were. I'd like them always to be better informed. But the absence of the need for having a highly educated workforce took the pressure off the education system. My contention, one thesis here for you. The other part of the thesis is that our institutions are just not, our public school institutions, are just not constructed for experimentation and continuous learning. They are constructed for stability. Among, you can see if these characteristics square with your perception of the system. If you look, normally I'd say the banking industry, but that's a bad example today. If you look at telecommunications, for example, you could not begin to find enough human operators to sustain the communication levels that we all are now used to by going through switchboards. Just couldn't do it. So technology has advanced our communications ability. When it comes to financial transactions, the clearing of checks couldn't be done unless it were done by the substitution of capital for labor. Agriculture is another great example of the substitution of capital for labor. Today we feed ourselves too much. We feed ourselves by using fewer people, actually, than in the education labor force. There are many more teachers than there are farmers in the United States. But schools are remarkably resistant to the search for capital that could transform instruction. There are very few incentives to do that, and any vendor who has some new program that he or she believes will be effective to always will couch it as how to supplement the teacher. It will not replace the teacher. They've learned the culture, and they're not going to say that. They're going to say this assists the teacher, not replace the teacher. Try to conduct an experiment in education. Talk to public school teachers about doing it. The first thing you're going to get back is, well, I can't experiment with a student. It would put them at risk. Like the status quo doesn't put some of them at risk. It does. Now, of course, I don't want to subject small children to phrenology experiments. But we can't advance this endeavor with which we're all connected unless we have some reasoned way of finding out what works and what doesn't work. And yet there is awesome resistance to doing it. We do allow innovation on a micro scale. There are lots of teachers trying new things in their classrooms. There are lots of principals who try new things in their schools. But there is no mechanism for taking an innovation to scale if there's a suggestion that it works. There are very few mechanisms for doing that. These innovative ideas sort of die of bourning. They don't get a chance to get spread. In contrast, many physicians in the United States, as a part of their medical school training, are taught to engage in different treatments where it seems appropriate. They don't have to have randomized field trials. They don't have to have full experiments. But if they find some treatment that appears to be useful, they are encouraged to write it up and circulate it to their colleagues or even publish it. So, but our teachers, of course, are not really trained to publish or trained to engage in scientific research, and are seldom given any incentives or rewards if they do. I've already commented on this. We pay as much for failure as we do for success in the United States. School's not working, pour more money into it. School does work. Does it get more money? No. It's the absence, it's the severance of any link between resources and performance. So we come full circle here. Let me go on. The consequence of a reluctance to rely on and build a research culture means, in my judgment, two things. That education is highly subject to fads washing across the practice landscape. Secondly, it leaves huge areas of significant knowledge gap for us. Now, some of you are almost assuredly a better historian than am I. But here are some fads I remember. Oh, well, let me go back even before me, which is hard to do. 100 years ago, which is before me, 100 years ago, homework was thought to be dangerous. And there are repeated books on how homework promotes disease and should be avoided. Now, I think that's funny because I believe in appropriate homework. However, last year, 2007, two education researchers at an unnamed institution two education researchers published a new book on the dangers of homework and attribute childhood obesity to homework.
Oh, no.
No joke, no joke. The school board in Santa Cruz, California, the last bastion of the Soviet Union, the school board in Santa Cruz banned homework. Teachers cannot give homework. And I thought the reasoning was interesting. Because high-income youngsters will do it, low-income youngsters won't do it, and it'll widen the gap. I thought, you know, that tells me a lot, not simply about your values. I want to help the low-income youngsters. But this could be an effective technique if structured appropriately. So why abandon it? But they did. So homework, it goes up and down as a good thing to do. Those of you who have read, and I commend it to you if you haven't, David Tyak's book, The One Best System. Marvelous piece of history about, in the turn of the century, the adoption of scientific management in school administration. And how this, if we just did it the way industry did at those, this was the Taylor era of Frederick Taylor. This is cheaper by the dozen. This is the belief in scientism can solve almost anything. If we can just make our schools more scientific and manage them more systematically, like industry, then children will learn more. Coming forward in time, I don't even have to go way back to when phrenology was an accepted part of science. But coming forward, I've been into an era when I was a teacher and school principal. The British infant school was put forth as the great model, and we started to build schools without classroom walls. Because this would promote learning. It promoted chaos, but we went for it. Then in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, we had eminent scholars, the president of Harvard University, James Bryan Conant, writing about the inefficiencies of small schools and how we needed to capture both the economies of scale in small schools, and we needed to give youngsters the benefit of larger schools so that the curriculum covered an important spectrum of offerings. So man, we consolidated districts, we closed schools, we made it bigger. Some stunning statistics for you, true facts. 25% of America's school students go to school in 1% of our school districts. 50% of our students go to school in 5% of our districts. We made the system bigger. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and for Bill and Melinda Gates I have great admiration, and apparently the work of that foundation with AIDS in Africa is truly stunning and to be admired. Bill and Melinda Gates, when it comes to education, have checked their brains at the door of something. I've never seen a foundation waste so much money, including now smaller schools. We're back. They might be right. I don't know. I don't see the evidence. Don't have it. But that's just an example of how we go through these cycles of big, small, and it happens over again. And I know you all have other examples. This scripted instruction was supposed to be a great deal. We weren't going to really leave it to Mrs. Jones to teach in her classroom. We would give her a script and tell her how to teach, then she couldn't really screw up. Well, yeah, if we only knew what script to give her, maybe that's true. So it makes us very subject to fads. That's a problem. And the current reform du jour is professional development. Pop! Everywhere. Coaching. Pop! Bob Castrell and I know a publication, I'm sure Patrick and other colleagues here know of it, where there is a proclaimed effect size of 2.5 for coaching. Now that means if you used coaches, you would elevate achievement 2.5 standard deviations. Now if it were that good, you wouldn't need anything else. Just give them coaches and everything else you can put aside. I mean, that's just, frankly, that's a charlatan-like proclamation. No serious researcher should ever say anything like that. Professional development makes a lot of logical sense. But right now it's just a bandwagon that people are piling on. So, the fads abound. But here, I'm going to do this very, oh my God, am I going to do it quickly? So I just plucked a bunch of areas where I really wish I knew more when I have the opportunity to advise state legislatures or courts or school districts, etc. I really wish I knew more about preschool. I think it might be effective, but under what conditions? I'd like to know. The teaching, and really now here our colleagues from teaching and learning here, curriculum instruction may have, but I don't think we know enough about this. Some youngsters react to one kind of teaching, some to another. Professional development, I've already said too much. Effective class size, we've got this slender little Tennessee STAR study which covers the primary grades, does show some positive effects, most of them the really early grades from smaller class size. Makes sense. But one cannot easily generalize from it to other grades, though people try to. We don't know enough about that. And probably reducing class size is just about the most expensive reform you can undertake. Optimum school size, who knows? What did I skip? Oh, okay. Preferred practical means for instruction, instructional supplies and materials, including technology, performance incentive systems. I happen to believe they are worthy of being tried, but I don't have absolute proof to tell you that they work. I can't, no one can say that presently. I'd like to know what an accountability system is that fairly treats schools and education professionals and rewards them. So maybe you've got a different list, and I would listen to it. But meanwhile, let me cut so we have some time to chat. Let me go back quite a bit. I want to get to a slide I skipped over about what to do about all this. Yeah. What do you do when you don't know what to do? Now, my claim is that our technical understanding is limited. There are two things I do believe in. There are probably smaller classes in the early grades, though very expensive. And I believe, as best I can sum it up, Richard Rothstein's research about the effects of schools, effect size of schools on the variance in student achievement. Richard's, I think, exhaustive review suggests that no responsible researcher has ever concluded that schools have any effect greater than 33% in explaining variation in student achievement. That the other 2/3 is explained by genetic endowments, neighborhood context, peer group interaction, home environment, those kinds of things. Schools can do about 1/3, which is a purchase. I mean, it's worth, you wouldn't throw this instrument away if you could get 1/3 of a purchase on a problem. But I deduce from that particularly for low-income youngsters who are disadvantaged in other ways, one thing I believe in is that probably the more schooling they have, the better it is for them. And I think it makes sense to extend the school year when you can, to have summer school for these youngsters, to encourage staying in school, avoiding truancy, maybe preschool. But anyway, the exposure to formal instruction, I think, is a good thing. Matt Springer, who I know visited with you, Matt's been analyzing the consequences of supplemental education services under the No Child Left Behind Act, and finds that when they are offered, and when students take advantage of them, their achievement goes up. The problem is that too often they are offered and the students don't come. But when they come, it pays off. Well, here we go, all too fast. If you don't know what to do with precision, then I think you follow this paradigm. You specify within reason what you want. Then you encourage as many approaches as appear responsible to the pursuit of those objectives. I don't want just one size fits all. I don't want silver bullets. I want a lot of efforts at trying to achieve those goals. Thirdly, I want to rely upon internal markets so that the system has some self-correcting capacity. Let me illustrate that. In the Clovis Unified School District, whoever heard of it, it's in California, outside of Fresno, 70,000 students, one of the bigger school districts. In Clovis, I was taken by the fact that the superintendent in the budget doesn't allocate money for maintenance. It puts the maintenance money out at each school. Now, not major maintenance, but upkeep. And this principal has the authority either to contract with the Clovis Unified School District Maintenance Office to undertake what's needed, or can contract with a local licensed vendor. That maintenance department is as responsive as anything you've ever seen because their budget depends upon getting a transaction from the local school principal. Their budget is contingent on what will be transferred from the school to them. In another large school district, they took all this huge staff development, professional development group of people that were at the central office who went out and presumably helped schools. They put the money for staff development, professional development, they put it at the school site and then said, you can buy the services of the central office professionals if you want. Or you can buy the services for them somewhere else, a university or consulting or whatever. Well, suddenly the central office staff became remarkably attentive to what the schools wanted to do because their very salary and existence depended on this. Then lastly, there are school places where youngsters make a transition from the primary grades to middle grades or on to secondary school. And the internal market operations permits the receiving teachers, the recipient teachers, have some financing that they can reward either the school or sometimes even the classroom that sends them students if they do a particularly good job of it. Some of the performance pay is located in a school to give down to the sending school, sending district, sending teachers. So to create an internal market around it all. Now, data is crucial to this. You can hardly measure enough. I mean, there is a point at which measurement overdoes it. That point is where you're not going to use the data. If you're not going to use it, don't collect it. It's not fair because there are transaction costs involved. But a really good data system, measurement system in a district, school district, is crucial to this. I say engage in fast failure. Encourage innovation, but as soon as you find out it's unlikely to work, stop it right there and try something else. Move on as fast as you can. Don't just keep it going. Then induce competition and reward successful providers. Now you can't have, it's difficult to have competition in every setting. I'm on my way to Alaska. You got 30 students riding snowmobiles 20 miles a day to school. I don't know really how to set up a competitive environment there. I don't know how to do it every place, but where it's feasible, I would. Then I think you reward success as lavishly as you possibly can. You celebrate success in every way, symbolically and financially. And then finally, all of these things are intended to construct a culture of continuous improvement in schools, in districts, in states. And let me end by saying, generally, within some boundaries I hope you'll tolerate, generally, that's what the state of Texas has done. So it is possible to translate this into policy. Now, there are some exceptions and fallbacks, but that's where I stand. I apologize for talking longer than I anticipated. That's a consequence of being unprepared. But I welcome your observations. You get equal time, or almost equal time.
Yep. You talked about 50% of the kids being in 5% of the school districts. I'm assuming you're talking about the large urban districts.
Right. Dade County.
Any comments on how those districts can get their act together, if you will, in terms of moving forward? Could you apply these principles in those settings?
It's a terrific question. For those of you in the back who perhaps could not hear it, Reed has asked, what if so many youngsters are in the big cities, and if you were thinking strategically, that's where you try to work. I actually am hopeful about selected big cities because under Rod Page, I thought Houston made terrific strides forward. And virtually everything here was then, and to some degree still, going on in Houston. And I think they have improved the education in that district, just this way. Now, overcoming inertia was huge in the system, and the bargaining with teachers and on. But Houston now, for about 15 years, has been pursuing these, I think, to good effect. Here is one measure. They used to have many more charter schools in Houston. Now, I hope some informed people will confirm this or tell me if I'm wrong. But there used to be many more charter schools in Houston than there are now. And so I pose the question, why? What's going on? Well, because our local schools are working so much better, people are opting for them. They could choose something else, but parents are more satisfied with them. So the worst schools of which I know are Washington, D.C., Memphis. I'd slit my throat before I generally put one of my children in anything but a boutique school in one of those districts. So, yes, Bob?
Is there, I kind of want to follow up on that and add to Houston, I think Pittsburgh in the 70s and 80s, Atlanta in the 70s and 80s would be examples of really good districts. And I have kind of two questions. One is, what other districts would you point to in the last 30 years? The other one is, my sense is all those districts did well at the elementary level and not well middle and high school.
I think I completely agree with you. This Clovis, to which I previously referred, Bob, is the best managed district I've ever seen anywhere, if you'll take 70, 75,000 kids as being big. It's 3 times bigger than Washington, D.C., right? So, okay. But your general observation that these places have done better at the elementary level and the secondary level, I think is right. I agree. And now don't ask me what to do about it, because
Or what?
yeah, now I draw a blank.
I think the book you did with Paul Hill 10 years back tells the answer.
Well, no, the book to which Bob is referring is a book that Paul Hill, Mary Pierce, and I did. And there, what we advocate is that, and then we had to wear a ski mask for the next 10 years after putting it forth, but it was that school districts school boards should not operate schools directly. Their school district should not employ any teachers. That what the job of a school board is to manage a menu, a spectrum of charter schools. And that the employer, the charter school employer, is the one to whom the teachers report. And we thought and of course, the school board continually should be evaluating the success, both according to parents and achievement, of those schools. And where they don't work, move them out and get a new manager. The book is a raving success among a restricted band of conservative professors. No one else reads it.
The students do. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Patrick.
Sort of following up on that point, Jim, and sort of speaking to your idea of fast failure, there's a research corporation, I forget the name, but the product, the service that they are packaging and pushing is rapid, small N experimental evaluations for school boards of policy interventions for school boards. So a school is considering switching to a different math curriculum. Okay, they want to make an informed decision. This operation comes in and says, okay, we're going to do a quick randomized field trial of the textbook. And so there's 3 months research design, 6-month actual administration of the trial, 3-month write-up, and a year later, they have the results of an experimental evaluation to inform their decision. Do you think that there are prospects for that kind of an approach having a significant positive effect on these kinds of developments, better informing those kinds of judgments?
Patrick, that's the most hopeful thing I've heard in a long time. I'm very pleased. I hope that company succeeds. I hope you and others in the room will help it succeed. And if it succeeds, let's buy some stock now. If there's any money left with which to buy stock. I don't know. That's exactly what now, what school district can have the expertise to do that? Not many. But you could buy it, you could rent it, and I think that's very hopeful. Now, I know that we have colleagues here from sort of outside of education administration policy and curriculum and teaching and so forth, and I apologize if my remarks are offensive. I don't mean them to be, but I would welcome any of you who have an alternative view and would like to say it before we close this down. I don't want you to go, I guess I don't want you to leave. You can leave sullen, but just not mad. Yes.
impressed by the German system where students have an, I think theirs is more deterministic, but thinking that schools should have an option. Not everyone should be prepared to go to college, but it would be, we'd probably keep more students in school if the ones who didn't want to go to college could go to a technical school where they could come out and get a decent job, or at least be part of the way towards getting a decent job. And I say that because in my family, my father was gifted with his hands. He ended up being a rocket mechanic for NASA. But,
Not at all bad, huh?
no, but he was a hands-on person, learned his trade in the military. You know, and I thought nieces and nephews, you know, they kind of picked up that usefulness. But it seems like our educational system, by saying every student needs to have this goal, and we need to make them all the same, that those are the kids that are dropping out, because they're saying, this system doesn't have any meaning for me, because when I graduate, it's not going to get me anywhere.
Well, I respect your observation and identify with it. I kind of offer you an alternative to consider, but it's not because I think you're wrong. I think your observation leads to kinds of theme high schools or secondary schools, some of which are oriented toward that which you describe. The only reason I don't sort of jump on board and swallow the existing German apprentice system, where it makes big decisions, high-stakes decisions about youngsters early, is I graduated from high school with a very solid D average. And if the United States didn't have a community college system, I wouldn't be in front of you. I never would have worked in the White House. I never would have had a second chance.
Well, I'm not saying
I know, you're not going to dampen that either. But I would expand the choices within our high school system so as to pursue, and then do research about it. Yes, Barbara?
But then I hear from my teacher colleagues that within the high school systems, within the elementary school, since No Child's Left Behind, the steady focus has, in fact, instead of broadening the opportunities, have narrowed them somewhat. Could you address that?
Yes, Richard Rothstein would concur with you. That as a critic of No Child Left Behind, he says and documents that it has had the effect of narrowing the curriculum in high school. He would agree. And I think that's a shame. That means to me we don't have the right metrics in place everywhere if that's how it's shaping things. My response, which he doesn't respect, is that, Richard, there were a lot of youngsters previously not learning how to read, write, and count, and I'd like them to do that. And then I'm open to whatever other things you want to measure. So I believe that No Child Left Behind, with flaws, I'm not going to get an argument, but with flaws, it has changed the culture of schools toward accountability. It just didn't exist before. Go ahead.
You use the simplistic thing of read, write, and count, which, yes, I agree with you, and yes, that is the curriculum of elementary schools. But when we get to secondary schools, there are the next level going, and it's somewhat demeaning of the schools that you keep saying read, write, and count.
And I think it's demeaning of me when you say it's simplistic. So now we've traded barbs. And you're a barber. So I apologize. I don't mean to demean certainly what teachers do. I meant it when I said it was the last honest work I did to be a high school teacher. And I certainly am open to an expanded set of measures that reflect fully what we expect of our high schools. I agree with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just toss in for what it's worth. When I was in Massachusetts, during the period that the high-stakes graduation exams were introduced, there was one of many controversies concerned the voc schools, the vocational high schools. And there was quite a split within the vocational high school community about whether this was a good or bad thing for them, whether to be held also for their students, also to be held to these standards for
10th grade performance in math and English. It was applied to them, and the opinion totally shifted in favor that this was a good thing, that they had performed to those levels, and that this was a good thing because whether or not they were going to go on to higher education, and a very high percentage of them would, actually, and needed to do so, whether it's in the community colleges or some other kind of post-secondary education, or whether it was going into the workforce immediately, that those skills were increasingly demanded. Or, the obvious examples are given numerical controls on, machine tools and the like. So that's just one observation that addresses in some measure this question.
Well, again, let me end where I started with my expression of appreciation for having been invited to a place that I think is increasingly exciting, and to which the nation increasingly looks for good research. I admire what you and your colleagues and your dean have done, and thank you again for inviting me.